You're listening to Proven Perspectives, a podcast with John Hawkins, the founder of Leadership Edge. I'm Laura, John's daughter, and in each episode, we'll explore a topic related to life, leadership, or mentoring. Through over 50 years of faith in Christ, John has learned proven life and leadership perspectives that will equip listeners for a lifestyle of leadership in their marriages, families, careers, communities, and churches. Hey, Dad.
Hey, Laura. It is always so very good to hear your voice.
I know. It's good to hear yours, too. Man, you guys are having an eventful week with a kitchen renovation underway and some sickness and just lots going on at you guys' house. How are you doing?
Doing good. Yeah. If people came to see us today, they would think, John and Janet have no kitchen whatsoever.
Or bathroom.
Our kitchen
downstairs
is down to the studs, and our downstairs bathroom is completely gone. And they're about to take on the upstairs guest bathroom. So it is a little crazy here. And fortunately for this recording, the workers have gone for the day, so there won't be a lot of hammering in the background. But then, yeah, I'm still getting over COVID. I am on my 11th day of testing positive, so not trying to set any records here, but it seems as though
please don't.
This has been a little bit of a bear for me to shake, but I just keep praying, and I know God will heal me up as he sees best.
We are ready for you to get well. I'm definitely praying for you and glad that you feel well enough to do this today. So, by the way, did you guys watch the Super Bowl last weekend? I didn't even ask you that.
Yeah, we did watch the Super Bowl. We are those people who don't watch any professional football until the Super Bowl, and that's
are those people as well.
Yeah.
So but you weren't able to cook, because I mean, the thing for me about the Super Bowl is just, and for my family, is just all of the delicious like dips and sides.
Yeah.
So you weren't able to cook anything this year, I guess,
well,
with COVID and all.
Yeah, I wasn't. Janet cooked some of, in Texas, what they would call Rotel cheese sauce.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that.
So we had some of that with some sausage in it and some chips, and then, some, I think, apple slices, and just kind of a low-key kind of snack dinner kind of thing. But it was
cool.
It was fun. Laura, I'm just like old. Like pretty much every commercial of the Super Bowl went right over me. I'm just like, I don't know who these...
I thought you were going to say you didn't know who any of them were.
Well, it's like I don't know who they are. And it's like part of the whole thing is that you recognize these people, and I have no idea who any of them are. And then a lot of the products, I don't even know what they're talking about. So I just thought, good grief, pop culture has completely passed you by.
Well, you are starting to sound a little bit like Grandma.
Yeah.
I think your mom used to have the funniest, whoever that even is.
Yeah.
And
then she'd say, Law, I've just lived too long.
Yeah.
So I guess I have become Grandma Ann. I don't know. But
yeah. Well, I know that, I mean, I guess she would be a wonderful person to be like.
Yeah.
But I know with the Super Bowl, and then another big event from the news this past week has been just the earthquake relief efforts in Turkey and in Syria. I know you've been watching the news and kind of thinking through those huge leadership endeavors. So tell us a little bit about that and what you've noticed or what's captured your attention with it.
Yeah, just thinking about the scope of the Super Bowl was just, amazing to me. It's like over 112 million people watched this thing. And
Wow.
There were, I think, 68,000 in attendance. And, I just thought, how do you, as a leader, if you're in charge of the Super Bowl, where would you begin? In terms of just all the coordination, all the different parts, the technology, the sport and the players and all the people in attendance and the entertainment and the commercials. It's just like, what an amazing leadership endeavor. It's fascinating to just think about all the planning, all the coordination. But then you shift to something way more important than the Super Bowl, just the horrible effects of the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. And, I think earlier this week, over 35,000 people have died. And the World Health Organization's predicting that 23 million people will be affected by the tragedy, including almost 1.5 million children. And so with both of those, like how do you address that need in Turkey and Syria? And both as the government, as the NGOs and ministries that come in and help to make a difference with it all. Just the scope of partnerships and the coordination that both of those require. And leadership is right in the center of it. So I look at those and just kind of look at them with wonder of how do these things happen? How do they get done? How does the leadership occur? I guess in some ways it helps me to appreciate that, the leadership that God's called me to has been, a lot smaller level and a lot easier to understand. This is the 30th year of Leadership Edge. And, as we began it in 1993, we had a very committed board of directors, and Janet, my wife, your mom, was very committed, but pretty much on a day-to-day basis, it was God and me. We were the two people who were doing Leadership Edge. And yet that was such a rich kind of moment, opportunity to kind of learn how to do it with God, to understand and launching this nonprofit of a sort that, we didn't appear that had ever been done before. What part was God's part and what part was my part. And I remember in that time, 1 Corinthians 15:10 really became an important verse for me. Paul's talking here, and he's talking in some ways about how he was a very unlikely candidate to ever have been an apostle of Christ.
Yeah.
But he speaks of that, Paul does, and he says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. And boy, I felt all of those things in the early days of Leadership Edge. I felt by the grace of God, I am what I am, meaning I'm not maybe the most apparent or most likely person to start a Christian nonprofit leadership development organization, but I'm the one God chose. And by his grace, I am the man that he's made me to be and that he wants me to be in leading this. And I worked hard. And I can say, honestly, through all the years of Leadership Edge, but especially the early years, I worked really long, hard hours. And yet, as Paul says, though it wasn't I, but it was the grace of God that was with me. So I think that it's great for those of us who are moms or dads or leaders in business or pastors or governmental leaders, wherever it is that we're called to be, to just on a regular basis think about, okay, what's God's part of this and what's my part and how does that all come together?
No, that's really good. Well, and as you were talking, there were a couple of thoughts that came to mind. One, when you were talking about 1 Corinthians 15:10 and like almost just the way that you described that, like you didn't use the term that it was a sandwich, but it's like, at the top, it's by the grace of God, we are where he puts us.
Yep.
But then also he really does call us to work hard. And then the thing that enables us to work hard is his grace. So that's just such that's a really great verse and a helpful one for me. And then also the way you started when you were talking about like the huge support you had from mom, especially, and also the board, but that day in, day out, a lot of it was you and God, and just how I was thinking, I know for me, like that's where my faith grows so much is when it's just, okay, God, like I have nothing to like put hope in other than you. And I was thinking both like God in some ways really opened a lot of doors for you. Like somehow you showed up at Duke and had opportunities to teach classes. And, like I know you had to rely on God's grace and work hard in that. And then also you were recently telling the kids this story of just how hard the finances were. And I know you've talked about this on the podcast before, but how there were some times when you would drive to pick up the mail saying, God, if there's not money, I don't know what we're going to do. Yeah. And then there was no money. So yes. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on like how you learned some of those or like what God was doing in you to teach you about this in that season, or do you have any more thoughts on that?
Well, I think that we talk a lot on the podcast about that it's all to be to His glory and honor.
Huh.
And it's hard for it to be to His glory and honor if it's not about Him, if it's not us trusting Him, if it's not, us trusting Him and seeing Him come through. I remember one time I was invited to meet with the head of an enormously well-endowed foundation. This was very early, first year or two of Leadership Edge, and they had plenty of money, and we needed plenty of money.
Yeah.
And so I went in and, to ask him if their organization would make a donation to Leadership Edge. And this was actually the foundation that was related to a huge pharmaceutical company. Okay. And so the man said to me, he said, John, you're not really in the space of things that we would fund, but our company would like to hire you to develop a training program on leadership and change that could be presented to schools of pharmacy. And so I was like, well, boy, I'd really be interested in doing that. And the whole time I'm saying, yes, I'd love to do this. The other part of me is like, John, you've never done anything like that before. You don't know how to do
minor details.
You don't know how to do corporate training. And, you don't, he's wanting this to like include PowerPoint, and you don't even own PowerPoint. You don't even know what PowerPoint is. And so I walked out of that meeting just wondering, am I just like a fraud to say, oh, yeah, we'd love to do that? And that night, Janet and I were invited to a dinner, and the couple we were sitting with, I kind of get out of myself and ask him, what's he doing? He says, well, I'm just completing my master's in business communications at North Carolina State University. And I'm like, do you know how to do training programs and PowerPoint and all that stuff? And he's like, yeah. And I said, would you show me how to do that? And he said,
that's cool.
He said, yeah. And so it was like right there, God had provided. But
that's really cool.
Just one of those situations where, God had called me to a place, and as I trusted Him, He just kept providing. We kind of got to a place where we were really needing to figure out with the students we were working with, what is our training program in leadership going to be? And again, I'd never done that before. And so I meet a Fuqua MBA student who I become a mentor for. He is a graduate at that point of West Point Military Academy, an amazing leader and leadership educator, and now is actually the head of the Behavioral Science and Leadership Department at West Point. And he was there, and he helped us know how to put together training programs for university students at the time. So I think a lot of this thing about God's part and ours is as we trust Him, then He comes through. And it's not always in the way that we would want, and it is not always, the easy way.
Yeah.
But He always comes through. He has always come through.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And just that He did it in ways that, in big and small ways, were like, there was no way you could have done it yourself.
Absolutely not. No. And because of that, now 30 years later, who gets the glory for all of this? He does. Because He was the one who thought up Leadership Edge. He's the one who enabled me and all the others who have worked in Leadership Edge to do the things that we've done. And it was always for Him. It was always to Him and for Him and from Him and by Him. Yeah.
No, that's really good. Well, and this kind of ties into, I know you believe that in leadership, we learn some of our most profound lessons on God's sovereignty and man's free will. So flesh that out a little bit
Yeah.
more.
So this whole idea of, God's sovereignty, or not just idea, the reality of God's sovereignty, but man does have free will. It's as we, willfully choose to follow him, then in the different leadership initiatives in our marriage, family, careers, communities, and churches that we take, we see him sovereignly affect his purposes, and we see him using our actions to help accomplish his purposes, to where, anyone who works, they work out of, their will, their choice. But for Christians who are regularly redevoting themselves to God and depending upon his grace, then we see how God uses both his sovereignty and our actions to accomplish God's purposes. And that's a pretty wonderful thing.
Yeah, no, that's really good, Dad. Well, and so I know that we always try to get back to where we see this in the Bible.
Yeah.
And I know you've talked about seeing it in Christ and his life and his crucifixion. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, the crucifixion of Christ, we don't tend to think of it that way, but it was a leadership initiative. Like it was a group of people who were brought around a vision. And that was the vision of vilifying Christ as, an enemy of the state or enemy of the Jewish faith, and bringing people together around that vision and moving it forward to the point to where Christ is crucified. And so, if you ask the question, so who's to blame for the crucifixion of Christ? Well, you could answer it biblically a lot of ways. You could say, well, Judas was, because Judas betrayed him. Or you could say the Jewish leaders were, because they're the ones who, kind of finally came after him and prosecuted him and talked the government into his crucifixion. You could say the Roman government was at fault. But it's interesting how in Acts, as the crucifixion is talked about in retrospect, it says in Acts 2:23, this Jesus, who was delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. So the leaders here in Acts are saying to the Jewish people, yeah, you crucified him. You led in him being killed, but it was all in accordance to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. And I think that for those of us who have read Isaiah 53, which is just an amazing prophecy about the death of Christ, it says of God, it says it was the will of the Lord to crush him. And so it's interesting to think that even in the crucifixion of Christ, which is absolutely the worst thing that has ever happened in the in the history of humanity, God's sovereign will was in effect. It was being accomplished. And in Psalm 119, it says, forever, O Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures to all generations. You have established the earth, and it stands fast. By your appointment, they stand this day, for all things are your servants. That's an amazing claim of Scripture. All things serve God's purposes. So again, this idea of, God's sovereignty and man's free will coming together, we see that even in the crucifixion of Christ, where it would have never happened if it had not been a part of God's sovereign will. And he used, fallen, sinful mankind to accomplish the purpose he had for the crushing of his son, for the salvation of mankind. So it's probably the richest, most poignant picture that I know of God's part and our part in accomplishing God's purposes.
Yeah, that's totally beautiful, and just such a comforting truth that there's nothing that happens that's outside of, like, he's always in control.
Yep.
Like no other person can thwart his plan, and also like we can't mess up his plan. And also, Dad, does this come from the show notes? This comes from the show notes that we're going to be attaching, right? So God's part and ours is a paper that we'll be attaching. And so there's more details from what you just shared in that. So I found that really helpful.
Yeah.
But I guess as you were talking, I was thinking, just how true that is and how comforting it is. And also in real time life, it's so easy, even though, hopefully every day we're reading our Bible and we're seeing, Old Testament and New Testament, like the sovereignty and power of God and like kind of how these things fit together. It's just so easy to lose sight of this, truth or this tension. I was thinking, I know you with some of the health stuff that you're going through. And I feel like with our health, we can either, this isn't the case with you, but either not pay attention to like our choices at all or become like hyper obsessed with it. I know for Adam this week with work, he has one of his biggest cases just like out of nowhere, like spiraled. And he was saying to me last night, like, I don't even know what the next step is. We were talking about actually this podcast and kind of where do you go when you don't quite even know, in this moment, what do I do next? And what is my responsibility? So I guess my question for you is, or even for me, we were talking earlier about, training kids, and we have a lot of responsibility in like intentionally, faithfully training our kids, but also so much of it God has to do. So I guess in our daily lives, just how can we think about God's part and our part?
Yeah. Well, it has to get to that. Like, how does this work out in daily life? And, I think the way that it doesn't work out so well is if we, focus, a lot of times what I do is just focus in on a kind of a way of thinking. If it's all up to me, I've got to pull it off. I've got to make it happen. I don't know how to do this. And there's just kind of this low grade panic inside of me with kind of a sense of, well, maybe if I get in a real bind, I can pray and God will help. So that's kind of one misdirected view. I think another one is we just finally kind of get cynical, and it's just like, my life is a mess. It's never going to be anything more than a mess. And every day, I'll kind of do the best I can, but I don't expect anything good or great to happen. Just kind of a low grade, cynicism. And I guess, maybe for some, there's kind of the idea of, well, it's all up to God, and I'm just going to kind of coast for a while and let Him kind of pull it all off. But as you know, those are not the right ways to be thinking about it. And as I've thought about, how do you think about it in a daily way? I jotted down a few thoughts. The first one is all of my responsibilities and work before me today have been given to me by God. So my job, my responsibilities, whatever I'm in charge of, whatever I'm to do, this came to me from God. The Bible clearly says that when we're doing any kind of work, that who we're actually working for is Christ. And, Ephesians 2:10 says that, God foreordained good works for us to do, before there was we even existed. So the first thing is just to realize all of my responsibilities, no matter how small or menial or how large they are, they've been given to me by God today. And the second thing is, and there'll be some parts that only He can do, only He can do. And I think, boy, you run into this with parenting all the time. I was just, talking to another parent today, and he was talking about one of his kids and just kind of the hardness of her heart in some ways. And there are all kinds of things that this guy and his wife can do to encourage her, to motivate her, to discipline her, But the part they can't do is change her heart. Parents don't have that ability. So even in the daily responsibility of parenting, this number 2 says there'll be some parts that only He can do. And it's really good to think about what those parts are. Like if you're dealing with an employee that's just constantly underperforming, you can train them, you can challenge them, you can write them up, you can do all kinds of things. What you can't do is you can't change, at least permanently, their attitude towards work. And so it's really good to think through every day, okay, God, here's the parts that you're that obviously you're going to have to do. And God, help me to trust you and to really trust that you're here and that you will be at work in these today.
Mm-hmm.
So first one is all my responsibilities have been given to me by God. Second one is there'll be some parts of the things I'm responsible for that only He can do. Third one is there'll be some parts that with my dependence upon Him for wisdom and grace, I need to accept that He's called me to do. So there's some parts that clearly are mine to do. And as I approach them, I need to do it with really prayerful dependence upon Him, for the wisdom and the grace to do so. And then the fourth thing is my day should be informed by these three realities, the three that I just mentioned, with a steady stream of prayer and trust in Him and doing what He's called me to do. So as I go through my day, I should remind myself every bit of this God's called me to. Some parts only He's going to be able to do. And I need to pray about those and trust those to Him. And the parts He's called me to, by faith, by dependence upon Him, I need to approach them, to go after them. And I think this kind of applies in anything. Like right now, Todd Melby, the president of Leadership Edge, and I are co-authoring a book. The working title is Building Leaders for the Church and Beyond. And, writing books for me, I've only written one other one, but it's kind of a daunting adventure. It's kind of like, God, help me to know, what an outline would be for this book. And then as I'm kind of filling out the outline, help me to know what to say, what you've taught me that you want me to put in here. And God, in this whole process, help me to see the parts that only you can do. Like, God, only you can remind me of the things you've taught me that should go into this book. And only you can kind of get Todd and me synced up in writing this together to where both of our voices are coming through good. So whether it's writing books, raising kids, whatever it is, again, this work has been given to me by God. There's parts of it that only He can do. There are some parts that I can and must do, but I need to do it with my dependence upon Him. And I need to continually be reminding myself and praying through that as I go through the day, especially in those moments of frustration. Does that all make sense, Laura?
Yeah, no, and I feel like you did give some really good practical kind of across the board tips of how to live this way. Like, the importance of kind of regularly recentering of ultimately I'm working unto God.
Yeah.
And then even, I know you've told me to do this before, of like stopping to get clear on, okay, right now, what is my responsibility and what is God's responsibility?
Yeah.
And then when you talked about prayerfulness throughout the day, I think those are all really helpful. And one other thing that stood out when you were talking about these different defaults we can get into, I think I can definitely be like the first and second of like kind of it's all up to me, but then probably even more so the defeated, like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna, and just get really discouraged. And actually, I read something in my quiet time this morning that was really encouraging to me. And I knew we were doing the podcast. It's Matthew 15:32. And it's when Jesus has been preaching to the crowd. It's like the time that it was 4,000.
Yeah.
And everybody is out of food. And so Jesus says to the people, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I'm unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint on the way.
Yes.
And my quiet time is just so encouraging because I think when I get into a situation where like I have no resources, like we're hungry or, whatever the thing is, I can so easily believe like, well, like I've really blown it and I've disappointed God and, can kind of just get into these really wrong ways of thinking as though it's all up to me. And, there was work for the disciples to do. They needed to like manage this project of figuring out who had food. And then the people who had food, like Jesus was asking them to give everything that they had, but that God's heart was like he had compassion. And for a person who, they had been sitting there listening to Jesus, they had hearts that wanted to honor him. Like his desire is to help us. Yes. And his desire, if we will admit our need, then he has all the resources, So anyways, that was encouraging to me. And I thought it was really encouraging what you were saying with, even on the cross, like Jesus and God's complete love for us and just absolute power and control. So that, I guess that really, it just makes me think there's so many reasons to be at peace, even in the midst of all of that. But I don't know if like any other thoughts you have on this, or those are my takeaways.
Yeah, no, those are great thoughts, Lauren. It reminds me, as I mentioned, I am sick, and yet, I have my job this week, and part of my job is writing, around the book and some other things. And so yesterday, I just felt horrible.
Oh,
but I knew, okay, I've got this job, and I just need to, trust God. God, help me today, even if it's in a lesser way than when I'm well. Help me to know kind of the next step to take. And show me. And it was amazing. As poorly as I felt yesterday, it was actually a pretty productive day of writing.
Cool.
And I just look at that and I think, well, there was God's part and my part, and God certainly played his part. And by his grace, I played mine. But, for our listeners, we hope that this has been an encouragement to you. And we hope that, whatever your responsibilities, wherever it is that you have influence, that you're able to think about God's part and your part, that you're able to see that the responsibilities have come to you from God, that there's some parts of them that only he can do, but there's a part he's called you to do, but to do with your dependence in him, and to keep that in front of you as you go through the day, and especially as you go through the frustrating moments. So listeners, we hope this has been of help to you. And as Laura mentioned, there are show notes for this episode that you can download. And we always encourage you to come to our website, www.lead-edge.com, and you can find all kinds of resources there on leadership, mentoring, and life. So Laura, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Dad. And thanks, listeners, for joining us.
Listeners, if you would like more perspectives on life, leadership, and mentoring, please go to the Leadership Edge website at lead-edge.com. Or if you have questions or ideas about future podcasts, please reach out to us at lei@lead-edge.com. We look forward to hearing from you.